Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 398 featuring Jinko Gotoh, who is a producer. You know, I love producers. And all the amazing work she's done in animation. She is absolutely incredible. I met her at THU. Really fun to talk to her. She has had a very interesting career, a very interesting path to how, in terms of how she got to where she is now. Again, this was one of my THU ones. We recorded it outside. It was really nice. I don't really record podcasts outside, so that's kind of fun. But yeah, it was a lot of fun talking to her and being able to share some of her stories. But definitely check it out on YouTube if you guys want to see, a little bit of a taste of what THU is like. Kristen, what did you think of Jinko?
Yeah, well, she has an incredible journey just of how she came to Hollywood. Kind of after being inspired by Lady and the Tramp and Astro Boy, also to learning computer programming. She then started her own production company, I believe at 27, so super young, and then realized she wanted to shift more into the film industry. And just her producing credits alone include Klaus, the Lego Movie 2, second part, Little Prince, Illusionist 9, and then the Oscar-winning Finding Nemo. And several of those are already Oscar-nominated films, so right. Amazing work. And then she just gives some good insight as just how to figure out your path to your dream, but you also have to take calculated risks, plot it out, give yourself options, be disciplined. So that was just it's not just like, oh, go for your dream. It's like, work it out. So that was really cool. And then you guys also discussed just how technology has changed the industry and the rise of documentary animation. So we get a lot of info in this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really cool. And, she's a very important person, especially there's a community called Women in Animation, and she's a big part of that. And so there's a link, if you want to know more about that, there's a link on the podcast page. So definitely check that out. But it was really great having her on and being able to do all those things, and to find out all that information from her. Great. We've got a couple of announcements, just to let you guys know. If you go to chaos.com, you will see that V-Ray 6 is out for almost all of our products. SketchUp, Rhino, Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Maya, Houdini, and the others are coming very shortly. But yeah, very exciting stuff. And so definitely go check those out. Lots of new features in all of those products. So really cool to have that. We have a few events coming up. Kristen, what's going on?
Yeah, so you can find these out at chaos.com/events. The first one coming up is October 26th. That is a free webinar, and you can watch to learn more about V-Ray 6 for Cinema 4D. And then October 31st, which is Halloween, we have another free webinar, which is V-Ray 6 for Rhino. And then November 3rd through 5th, it's an actual live event, which is for SketchUp at China 3D Design Summit. So you can meet Chaos and Inkscape there, and probably have a booth. So you can find more about these at chaos.com/events.
Perfect. That's great. Okay. And if people want to know more about the podcast, Kristen, where can they go?
You can go to facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast or chaos.com/CG Garage. And if you like to watch us, go to youtube.com/Chaos Group TV.
Perfect. And if you guys have any ideas or comments or anything you want to communicate with us about the podcast, you can always email us, labs@chaos.com. And don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, and a review would be also welcome. And make sure to share us with all your friends and family. But for now, please enjoy episode number 398 with Jinko Gotoh.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
It's so amazing how small this equipment has become, right?
I know. And I
used to days to carry, carry cases, right?
I used to come with this big, and I did audio only before.
Yeah.
And I came with like these big microphones.
Yeah, big
and
cases, I know.
And now I'm like, my entire audio video is in the capsule like
that's
this.
That's so cool. That is so cool. That's so cool.
So I'm pretty happy about that. Okay. So I don't know if you listened to any of the previous podcasts.
I haven't yet, sorry.
That's okay. That's
I
okay.
will.
This is very casual. So,
I will.
So this is good. So one of the things I like to ask is like, obviously, I've read a little bit about how where you are now, but I want to know how you got there. What was that journey that you took?
Okay, well, you got to listen to my talk tomorrow.
Yes, I will. But this is an audience that may not have the
Sure.
opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what is the thing that sort of inspired you to do to get into working in animation, that kind of stuff?
Well, it all started when I was very little. The
Okay.
first film I ever saw
Yeah.
was Lady and the Tramp.
Right.
So that had a huge influence.
Right.
And then shortly after, I met Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Astro Boy.
Oh, right.
So I got to go to his animation studio in Japan, and he showed me his cells and his background paintings. And when you're a little kid and you see this, it's magic.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not for every kid, but for me, it was truly magic.
Yeah.
So I said to my dad, when I grow up, this is what I want to do. And he said, well, Tezuka-san was a medical doctor before that.
Oh, right.
So that kind of instilled in me two thoughts, right? Here's what I want to do, but you got to do that before.
Right.
Yeah. So then we immigrated to the U.S.
Okay.
So this all happened in Japan.
Right.
And so when I got here to the U.S., obviously I didn't speak a word of English.
Right.
And so, you have to find ways to do well in school.
Well, what year was this approximately? How old were you?
I was 8 years old.
8
This was in 1967.
Okay.
So it's a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, sorry, 1966.
Right.
And so, so I was good in math. I was good in science. I was good with music. And so you kind of forget about all the things you love as a little child, even though we used to go and watch movies a couple times a year.
Sure.
So I ended up in engineering school.
Okay.
And I studied applied math. And I knew I didn't want to be an engineer, but, my dad was like, okay, one of you should be a doctor and another one should be a lawyer. If not, you guys should be someone should be a professor. I mean, it was very, very, traditional immigrant story.
Right.
Where the parents really want the kids to do better.
Right.
And that's getting the best education and picking a profession that's a very stable profession, right?
Right.
But I knew I didn't want to be an engineer. But in the junior year, I took a class called Introduction to Computer Graphics. So that began, kind of connecting the dots.
Right.
And so it made me visualize that maybe there is a way I can do animation from the technical standpoint, and eventually I'll get into the artistic side. And so I kind of concocted this plan, which was, okay, I got to be a real expert at this. And so I went and sought a professor that was doing this kind of research. And so I thought, I went and found him, called him up, and said, I want to work for you. And he said, Eileen, now I've got a job for a computer programmer. And, can you code in C? I said, yeah, I can code in C.
Okay.
So I got a job.
Okay.
And so I was working at the medical school, and this was after I graduated from engineering school. And he said, well, now you're a staff at Columbia, you could really go anywhere for grad school without paying tuition. So I thought, oh, great. I'll apply to film school.
Okay.
And I got in. And so that was the beginning of my film journey as a student. But, when I got out, way back then, this was in 1982.
Okay.
Really, the work being, coming out of film school with an MFA meant, you're going to drive taxi or you're going to be a waitress or you get a job as a PA, And Milos Forman was running the film program at Columbia. So I got invited to go on set. And then I met a set PA. And I said, how long have you been doing this? She's like, about 4 years. And I was like, oh, God, I can't be doing this for 4 years, It's a long way up the ladder to be a producer.
Uh-huh.
So I thought, no, this isn't for me. And so I was like, okay, well, what's another way? You know, and I thought, well, maybe I apply a job as a computer programmer and somehow I'll figure out a way. And so I applied a job, and this was with Northrop. You know, back then, aerospace, everybody in aerospace was doing, was starting to do CG.
Right, right.
And, you know, if you knew how to code in C, it's pretty easy to get a job. So got a job at Northrop, and
was this in Los Angeles?
yeah,
or West Coast?
Yeah, back in LA.
Yeah.
And I was like, I just can't do this, you know?
Yeah.
So I called the recruiter. The recruiter was very angry. But I said, it's better to say no now than to start a job and then quit.
Right.
So I didn't take that job.
Okay.
As part of my thesis film to graduate from film school, we had to do a film. And so I decided I wanted to do something different than animation, and decided I'll do some documentary work.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the time, my dad was teaching in Shanghai,
Mm-hmm.
and so the Cultural Revolution was just finishing up, right? And so I said, I want to go to China and shoot a doc about young people. So I spent the summer of 1981 shooting a documentary about two families, because over 13 million people were denied higher education during
Right.
the Cultural Revolution. And the revolution had just ended, so people that were denied higher education were finally being able to get higher education. So whether you were in your teens, or late teens, or in your 30s, they all got to go back
Right.
and get education. So I had two families that I spent the summer with, really trying to understand. And one was a commune family, and the other one was a factory working family,
Mm-hmm.
both with different circumstances of what happened in the revolution. So I shot this doc, and put it through the film festival circus, and it won a bunch of awards. And luckily, I got interviewed by Japanese media, because my dad was like, "Okay, you got a doc out now. You got to get coverage."
Right.
So, so getting that coverage allowed, basically a situation where people read it, and I talk about computer graphics, and not just a dog, but here's my dream. This is what I want to do. And so I got a call from an ad agency in Japan,
Interesting.
and they were getting ready for the 1985 Expo.
Okay.
And they were the primary agency doing all the creative work. And they're very, very clever, because back then, CG didn't really exist in Japan. Very little did. But it was starting to get pretty popular in the US, mostly on the commercial side.
Right.
So there are companies like Bob Abel Associates, there was Digital Production, there was a small group of them.
Yep.
And so then the ad agency basically was commissioning these companies to do these films for the various pavilions, mostly electronic pavilions. And so by doing that, they can show off computer graphics, even though it wasn't their computers doing this, but it kind of painted that picture, right?
Sure.
And so when they found out that I actually knew about this field, they hired me
Nice.
as an agency producer.
Okay.
So I got a job.
As a producer.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Which is different than programming or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is exactly what I wanted to do.
Right.
But just, wasn't working animation, but it was a foot in the door.
Right.
So I did that, and got to meet a lot of great people, and networked and opened a lot of doors for me. And then I had a sponsor from then to that was a managing director that really believed in me. And he said, you should start your own production company. And I'm going to get you someone to fund that.
Right.
So that happened when I was like 27 years old. And I'm like, okay, I guess this all kind of makes sense,
Uh-huh.
But little do you know that, I don't have skills to run a company or build a company. But, the people that funded me were very, very successful entertainment conglomerate and in Japan. So they said, you got to set your goals, et cetera. And they said, I'm going to give you $40,000 to start this company.
Okay.
And so I set a goal that I had to generate $2 million in revenues within the first 3 years.
Okay.
So remember, this is back in
Yeah.
late 80s, so that's a lot of
That's
money.
a lot of money.
Yeah, today's not a lot of money.
Yeah.
But
Well, for a startup also, yeah.
yeah, so what I was good at was really innovating ideas, but what I wasn't really good at was building a company or running a company,
Okay.
So I did that, and I got involved in a lot of computer graphic stuff that we were doing now for other types of large format events.
Right.
And back then in Japan, people were doing various types of, it wasn't an expo, but people were doing large format films for different types of events. And then I helped out on some of the commercials. But, I wanted to just keep innovating. So one of the things I came up with was, back then, MTV was huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to know the people at Propaganda Films, and what I did was I pitched a lot of the directors to direct Japanese commercials.
Right.
So I was probably the very first person to start producing commercials with iconic music video directors in Japan.
Right.
So I did that. That was exciting for a while, but then, this just kind of worsened because it's like you're nothing against the service industry, but, I want to make movies.
I hear you.
And so there was one summer when I was shooting a big campaign with Sanyo, and we had Bon Jovi, and we're in New York City for that summer, and it was really hot and humid, and we'd been working like 6 day weeks,
Right.
And then I remember walking by Radio Music Center, the Radio Music, what am I going to say? Radio City Music Hall.
Yeah.
And there was this big marquee, Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Uh-huh.
So, of course, I go
Of course.
watch this thing, and I'm like, it reminded me of my days of Lady and Tramp. I'm like going, what the hell am I doing sitting here making commercials,
Uh-huh.
And so I just promised myself I got to figure out how to do that, because otherwise, my life is just going to go on making commercials. So a few years later, by hook or crook, I got a job as the CG producer on Space Jam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was super exciting to me, because it was like, okay, here's a lot of the people that worked on Who Framed Roger Rabbit
Right.
now doing Space Jam, and we've moved away from doing optical work, and now we're going to the digital world, right?
Yeah.
So these guys that are won an Oscar for all the optical work at ILM, at Jones, had come over to Cinesite, which at the time was owned by Kodak.
Yep.
And they had come up with the technology of the first digital printer.
Yeah.
And they were also the ones that came up one of the first companies that came up with digital compositing.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked for them as a CGI producer, and that was groundbreaking in many ways. I mean, Toy Story was coming out just while we were in production, but that was all CG, where this was live action plates and CG backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
And so it was, then we had, animated characters with live action. So it was far more exciting than doing all of it in the computer.
Yeah, the compositing was more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that happened, and then Disney Feature Animation at the time was building their digital studio to do Dinosaur.
Right.
So shortly before I finished Space Jam, I got a call from Disney, and I also got a call from Digital Domain. DD at the time was going to do Avatar,
Right.
the first time.
The first time around. Yes.
First time around. So I got 2 job offers, but and I was super excited to go work on Avatar because of Titanic. But then I kind of felt like, is this really going to happen? And I kind of waited, and then they said, you know, we have this other big VFX movie that's in trouble called Dante's Peak.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Disney's like, are you coming or not coming? And
Right.
so I decided to go to Disney.
Okay.
And I ended up being the digital production manager on Dinosaur,
Right.
and helped build the digital production studio at Disney. And then eventually got promoted to be director of digital production for the entire studio.
Uh-huh.
But I was like doing administrative work at that point, and I was like, I'm just not really happy because, again, I didn't come to Disney to be an administrator. I came to want to produce movies.
Right.
So I left.
Okay.
And a couple months later, I got a job at Pixar.
Okay.
And I was hired as the associate producer on Finding Nemo.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that was really the the big journey,
Right.
up till basically 2003. And when we finished Nemo, they said, stay, we'll have another movie for you in a while. But meanwhile, there's this administrative job you can do.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to retool the pipeline.
Sure.
And I think, in those days, if you had both an engineering background and production background, it was easy to like pigeonhole you into these kind of jobs, right?
Right.
I was like, I don't want to be sitting here overseeing how we were going to retool the pipeline.
Right.
And so I left.
Yeah.
And that was 2003. And, ever since then, I've kind of traveled the globe and worked on pet projects. I've gone in and rescued projects, and
Right.
it's been a potpourri of stuff.
But let's talk about that role of producer. Like, there are many different types of producers, and there are many different things. And so, in a broad sense of things, what do you think a producer does? Like, what is the producer's responsibility?
Well, so there's the creative component of it, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the fiscal component of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, management component of it.
Like
So
the
for
logistics.
me, the logistics. For me, what's really important is, really to creatively partner with the director, and make sure that, your vision or their vision and your vision really connect.
Right.
Because ultimately, you have to be that director's partner, creative partner, to be a filmmaker. And if you don't have that, you don't have the fundamental basis, right?
Right.
And so that to me is the most important thing,
right,
for a producer. And because logistically, you hire a production team to handle that, but you've got to set that tone of how you want to manage things, and a lot has to do with that partnership that you have with that director.
Sure.
And then there's also if you go independent, you got to go raise money.
Yep.
And then you got to manage the people that give you the money, whether it's a studio or financier.
Sure.
And so you're always balancing that and making sure that you're protecting the creative vision of the film. At the same time, you got to manage expectations, right?
Right.
So I spent a lot of time managing those expectations, so that we're left alone to make the movie we want to make.
Right.
And then you get involved in marketing and publicity, and also the other important component for me is making sure that I'm there selecting the leadership of the crew.
Yeah.
Because that leadership is really going to be, your front line.
Right.
That's going to go hire the crew and maintain the creative integrity, and also, how you want to run the production.
Yeah.
So you want to find people of like minds with the same values, but at the same time, what's always important to me is that, we want to innovate the medium. So I'm always pushing to innovate that medium through storytelling, through visual storytelling. So you want to bring people that can actually, spearhead that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, everything starts to look the same and feel the same, and nothing wrong with that. But I think, the beauty of animation is that we're a visual medium where, you can do anything.
Right.
And so that's what's always been magical about animation for me. And that's why, I love animation. Like the first film I saw, Lady and Tramp.
Right.
Who would have thought, I've always loved dogs since I was a little kid. So, but to watch, talking dogs in the setting, I mean, that's like magic as a kid.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's great, and I think it's good that you're bringing magic to little kids yourself. But what I think is kind of unique, especially from a producer's point of view, not very few producers I know how to program and see, and have computer graphics backgrounds, and end up on the production side of things. I mean, that generally ends up being either in the technical side of things, or things. Shader writers or programmers. So it's interesting that you went into production. Like, what did you think about, like, how did that knowledge influence or help your knowledge of being a producer?
I think, early on in CG, you have to be pretty technical. And wherever you stood,
Sure.
And especially, a lot of production people didn't understand this. So, like working at Disney on Dinosaur, my position was really, really bridging the gap between the developers that would write code and the production people that were monitoring,
Sure.
because you've got to help them how to monitor that. It's like how do you monitor R&D, right?
Right.
It's not like you can measure R&D.
Right.
And you've got to create that space so that these developers can actually develop, right?
Right.
It's not like, you're measuring how many lines of code did you write, or how many errors did you get, that's not how you do things,
Yeah.
Because I think, programming is just as creative as, drawing, right?
Sure.
So I think, having that technical background and being able to understand, even though I can't write a shader,
Sure.
but we were building the first system, the muscle and skin system.
Right.
We're building the fundamentals of what exists today.
Yep.
In the pipeline, and having that technical understanding allows you to empathize with both the code writers and the production people.
Right.
And I think when you're creating or you're innovating, empathy is very, very important as a leader.
Right.
Because without empathy, I don't know how to create.
Right.
So I think probably having to do with the fact that I was an immigrant, having to come into a foreign place, didn't speak the language, and having to figure out how to adapt into that. I think gave me some skills about how to also be a good bridge between two different worlds or two different cultures. So, and ever since I was a kid, I like to make things, but just not me making, but collectively making things.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's why I want to do production rather than be a code writer.
Yeah. But code, I mean, you could be making code.
Yes, I could be making code. Yeah. I mean, I could have ran, I guess, a programming department, but that's not what I want to do.
Right. I mean, obviously, you talked about your father's influence on you and how he wanted to, like, no, you have to follow these steps. But you sort of did it, but did it anyway.
Yeah.
Like how did you? I mean, how did that feel about the pressure and overcoming that? And what would you recommend to people who say, follow your dreams or do what you need
Well,
to do?
I think I think you have to have discipline.
Okay.
Yes, we all have dreams, but you'll have to kind of figure out what that path is to that dream.
Sure.
And I think you have to be responsible. And yes, you got to take calculated risk. And yes, I've said no to jobs, but you kind of plot it out. And so here's your plan A, here's your plan B.
Right.
And here's the fallback position. I mean, you have to kind of work that through and do that exercise, and talk to your network of whether it's mentors or sponsors or your colleagues. You got to do a lot of soul searching and making sure that look, life is a risk. Any whatever you do, there's a risk involved,
Sure.
right? But I think you kind of plot it through, and if you believe in it, we all figure out a way to do this. And I think it's really having grit.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Like, how is this going to affect people's lives? Because I think a lot of people right now are just follow your dreams attitude. But I think that idea of having some discipline allows you to sort of think about where you're going to go. Okay. Now, also you've also went to film school, right? So
Yes.
how did film school influence, obviously, your knowledge of filmmaking and obviously had a knowledge there, but how did it work with that discipline and how you?
So it was interesting because I was at the Columbia film program, where the film program at that point was a lot of analysis, a lot of criticism work, and there were experimental films being made. And when Milos Forman took over the school, they started really focusing on the craft of screenwriting and directing. But the older faculty that had been there for a long time really focused on criticism and analysis. And what was interesting for me was taking especially the analysis classes because you dissected these great movies.
Yeah.
And so actually my engineering schooling, which is about, also problem solving and dissecting.
Right.
So I felt like I had an advantage over other students that came from mostly, from humanities,
Sure.
Because I think in engineering school, you're disciplined to be critical thinkers and be able to problem solve and analyze the situation you're looking at.
Sure.
So I felt like, I had best of both worlds,
Yep.
because now I was I was learning how to take great films apart. That doesn't mean that you become a great filmmaker by doing that, but I think it's important to know what makes great films.
Right.
So, I really, really enjoyed that.
Sure. Now, obviously, you have a deep knowledge of film from film school, et cetera. But how does animation fit in that? How do you find animation to be something, a genre of film, or even just as a method of making films?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm going to correct. Animation isn't a genre; it's a medium.
It's a medium. That's correct.
It's a medium, and the process is different because, a live action film, you start with a script. On an animated film, you have to have a good story,
Sure.
whether that's on a script form or a treatment form, but it's also a visual medium. And you have to remember, on an animated movie, you're creating every single frame.
Yep.
Right? So you got to create the world, and you got to create these characters, and you also have to ask the question, why are we animating this movie? Because if you can't answer that question, then go shoot it.
Right.
Because it probably isn't an animated movie.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the difference is that, you've got to ask that question first. And then our process is very different because in live action, you go shoot, then you spend your time in editorial.
Right.
When with animation, everything is centered around editorial. So the editor is involved from literally the first day you start the storyboard.
Right.
Because you're making the movie in editorial.
Right.
And it's a very iterative process, and also somewhat a linear process because you have steps.
Right.
So I think it's a very different form of filmmaking.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's interesting and a good perspective. Just like think about it in editorial, like the movie is being made from the end forward almost.
Yeah.
So it's also interesting. What do you think has changed? And let's start with it, like just the idea of technology and how long things take. From those early days when you were working, in Japan doing commercials, all the way to today. Like, what has changed in the process of doing animation?
Well, first of all, the advancement in technology is huge, right?
Right.
I remember working on the Expo 85, Hitachi Pavilion's film. You wait, 24, 36 hours for a single frame of render.
Right.
Now, you can render in real time.
Sure.
So that's a huge change.
Right.
When I started, there was no Avid. So, editing meant, you had film strips.
Right.
Same thing with sound,
Yep.
So technology has definitely advanced filmmaking, especially in the last, 20 years.
Right.
Which I think is, allowed more iteration, and I think it's changed the creative process, I think.
Okay.
Because you can iterate faster. So I think your creative process changes. Whereas the days when you had to do optical printing, for example, you have to be pretty decisive, right? Because once you run through that optical printer, you're done.
Yep.
Very different from digital compositing.
Right.
Where you don't like something, you hit the undo or do a new version of it, right?
Right.
So I think the discipline and the process has changed. And, and a music video had a big influence in how people shoot.
Yeah.
And, when you saw people like David Fincher go out and shoot live action, I remember talking to one of David's editors. He said, because David came from music video,
Right.
His shooting ratio was just out of control.
Right.
And the editor said it was just painful for them.
Right.
Because he didn't come from the world of film.
Right.
Where, you thought about what your shooting ratio was,
Right.
Not him, comes from that whole different world where shoot as much as footage you want, and then we'll go figure this out.
Yep.
So I think, technology has such a big influence into how we work.
Sure.
And how we work also influences technology, or what needs to, what we want technology to do.
Yeah.
And I think, originally it started more, I think in the 80s, I would say probably in the late 80s to probably the late 90s, we were limited to what we can do digitally.
Sure.
And now, you can do anything digitally.
You can. But my question is, like, if you think back in the 80s, our thoughts is like, what do I need to do to make this faster? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the problem we wanted to solve.
Yeah.
So what is the problem we want to solve today?
Well, the problem that I would like to solve today is that, I want to give opportunity for more filmmakers to make content.
Okay.
So how do you reduce that price point?
Right.
How do you reduce it so that it doesn't take, a crew of 300 people, 200, 300 people to make an anime film? How do you change that process that it doesn't take, 18 months to 30 months to run, to do physical production for animation? And so I think, in film, it's about materials and labor, right?
Sure.
In animation, it's pretty much labor is the major component of the cost.
Sure.
So if you can do it with a smaller crew, go faster without compromising quality,
Yeah.
then you're going to give more opportunities
Right.
for more content creation.
But it was, even back in, the late 90s or whatever, it was expensive to hire an animator. You know, it was $50,000 for an SGI, $50,000 for Maya,
Yeah.
and plus another $100,000 for it. So you're basically looking at $200,000 per seat.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
so it was very expensive. I mean, has that changed? Are we asking to get animators for less money, or are we basically?
No, the good news is now, right, which I love, is that I think, companies like Unity, Epic, groups like Blender,
Sure,
they've democratized software.
sure.
You can download it.
Yep.
Go do your thing, right?
Yep.
You can now, use a small box. You don't need to spend $50,000 to buy a piece of hardware.
Sure.
You've got the cloud to render,
Yeah.
and all you need is really a pretty solid workstation. That's what, $3,500, $5,000. It's
Right.
not 50 grand. And the labor cost isn't any lower, but there's a big thing called tax incentives.
Yeah.
That pay for a lot of this content today.
Yeah.
So it's I think we're starting to democratize.
I do remember, around 2006 when not real-time rendering, but an offline rendering, when finally we started to move away from rasterized rendering to
Yes.
ray tracing, right? And then suddenly, it used to be, and I would budget people to work on a show, you used to have to budget about 25 shots per person to be a lighter, right? And then when ray tracing came along and you didn't have to fake everything, then
Yeah.
suddenly you can do 150 shots per artist.
Well, depending on how much time you're giving them, but
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
it was much easier. It was
Yeah.
much more logical and physical based. So
Yeah.
it was kind of
Yeah.
an interesting thing. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, those types of advances are the ones that are going to sort of help democratize.
definitely.
it.
I mean, we're starting to see. I'm not as familiar as with Unity as I am with Unreal, but I mean, it's real time rendering. And
Sure.
now it's pretty photoreal, but I've seen samples of work where they're starting to create non-photoreal shaders and
Sure.
looks, and what you can do with that is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, I agree. I just think it needs to be ray traced in real time, which it can be.
Yeah, it can be.
It
Yeah,
can
it can
be.
be. Yeah.
It can be. So that's interesting. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about how animation as a medium
Uh-huh.
has changed, and how I did call it a genre by mistake, but I do think there's some ideas of what the different genres that have taken on animation has changed over the years, especially in the last few years.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about how people perceive animation?
So if you're in North America,
Uh-huh.
the way you perceive animation is, I think, very different from how you perceive animation in the rest of the world.
Right.
Because in North America, if you're especially looking at the film level, and I'm not an expert in the TV space, I can't really talk about the TV space, but
Sure.
when you look at the theatrical space, the people that have produced animated feature content are these temple studios, right?
Right.
You got Disney, you got Pixar, you got DreamWorks, you had Blue Sky, you have Sony. So because of how much money it takes to make these movies, these temple movies are all 4-quadrant and usually very comedy based.
Right.
So this is why I think it's very easy for Hollywood to say animation is a genre, because that is one type of movies, right?
Sure.
But if you look outside of North America, right? You look at Japan, for example. Look at anime,
Right.
and how anime has all kinds of genres. You can have horror, you can have comedy, you can have drama, you can have A to Z, right?
Right.
And I think the power of anime and its influence has been huge I would say the last 5 years.
Yep.
If I talk to anybody in the U.S. about anime, 10 years ago, they would go, "That's just fringe," and I'd go,
Yeah.
"It's not fringe," but that was the perception.
Right.
But anime has really influenced South America, Europe, the Middle East, and so I think that's a huge change.
Sure.
And then I think in Europe and Canada, I mean, there's so much subsidies that's allowed filmmakers to make all kinds of films. You
Right.
know, some of the most exciting things I see today are things that are coming out of Europe. You know, some of these profound films and shorts. You know, they're not afraid to touch different genres. And one exciting genre for me is doc animation.
Dark animation.
Documentary animation, right?
Okay.
So, for example, the movie Flea,
Right.
right? That was nominated in multiple categories.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it didn't win, but it was recognized
Sure.
as for best animated feature, best documentary feature, and best foreign, right?
Right.
And a movie like Flea, you're taking a very difficult subject matter, but by removing it from doing live action and putting it into the animation medium,
Sure.
you're able to really tell these difficult stories.
Explain to the audience what Flea is about so they have an idea.
Okay, so Flea is a story about a homosexual man
Mm-hmm.
that escapes Afghanistan,
Sure.
and it's his journey of basically ending up in Denmark, and it's his trials and tribulations. And you know, he didn't want to tell the story because he doesn't want to disclose who he is.
Right.
And the filmmaker that wanted to tell the story, you know, is a very close friend. And the only way that he would agree to tell the story was to make sure that he was never disclosed.
Right.
So you're telling an important story that should be shared
Right.
because it's a humanitarian story.
Yep.
From all aspects, right? There's an intersection of refugees, sexuality, you know, political asylum. I mean, there's so much intersectionality, and it's an important film. But to do that in live action, first of all, he didn't want to disclose himself, so
Sure.
that couldn't have been done.
And also telling stories that weren't necessarily filmed, like
Right? Because you can't really film it.
Right.
You know, right?
Yeah.
So I think animated documentaries, I think is a game changer.
Yeah.
Because now we're being able to tell stories that we couldn't before. You know, a couple
Sure.
years ago, there was a short. I can't remember the name of the short, but it was about sex trafficking.
Right. Oh yeah.
Another very difficult subject matter to tell. Right.
Right.
And this filmmaker got women from different parts of the world talking about their pain
Mm-hmm.
and their experience of being sexually trafficked. But again, you can't film that.
Right.
You can't disclose who they are. So animation is a medium that allows you
Yeah.
to share these difficult stories and help audience understand that there's a lot of bad stuff that goes out there.
Yeah.
And, you know, you want to inform people. So I really think, you know, animation is profound when you can use it that way as well.
Absolutely. I actually did a podcast with Bill Plimpton,
Yeah.
and he's talking about how he's been doing a lot of animation to fill in the gaps of things,
Right.
stories that haven't been able to be filmed, but have that visual story that goes with it.
Right. Yeah. So I think those things are really important.
Sure.
And now that our tools are accessible, right, and
Right.
affordable,
Sure.
that, you know, these stories that we haven't told before are being told.
Yeah.
So I think it's good for it's very good.
Yeah.
All around, you know, for everyone.
What about the idea of animations? You know, it used to be 4-quadrant in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
and now with streaming seems to be
Mhm.
so much more open to quote unquote niche genres, right?
Uh-huh.
Animations like Love, Death, and Robots and things
Yeah.
of that nature. What do you think about that and how that's going to change that as
Look,
well?
the more we can open
Yeah.
animation and really treat it as a medium and to have different types of content, I think is just super exciting.
Yeah.
Because again, animation isn't cartoon for kids. I mean, it's really a very, very powerful medium. I mean, look back what Walt Disney did back in, during World War II when he made propaganda films, and he was hired by different governments to make shorts that were all propaganda, right?
Sure.
So, I love the fact that, the streamers have now, created this platform where they want so much content and they're open to different genres because their job is to get people to watch, and the more variety you give them, the higher chance they're going to continue to watch that platform.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. I think it's an exciting world, and I just love the fact that you've been passionate about it since way back when, and so it got you into doing that. Are you happy with the journey that you've taken? Are you excited?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have life lessons about, should have done that, should have done this that way.
Right.
But, we all have our journey. And, I'm happy where I am, and I want to make more stuff and, make more movies and I'm looking really now into series space as well, because the series space has really opened up to different types of genres more than the feature space.
Right.
And I want to work with, emerging talent. And also what's important to me is really working with diverse talent so that we can tell stories that we haven't told before.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much
You're
for doing
welcome.
this.
Okay, thanks so much.